countries in the world. So the way that they do that caps on deposit rates. So the cost of capital is low. That is a very good tax. It's a tax on depositors who don't want to take any risks. If they want more money, they've got to go take a risk somewhere. But the banking industry would like you to believe that they deserve a higher rate of return on their deposit. There's no reason for them to get a higher rate of return. Instead, it's a tax. We tax our citizens for public purposes. And this is a very good tax. It's easy to extract, doesn't have a lot of blowback, but of course it affects financial sector profitability. They have a non-independent central bank because it needs to accommodate, and it does accommodate. And that's a very strong and important component in an efficient financial fiscal system. They have required bank lending to public projects, directed credits, and that's work. You have to do it well. You have to do it correctly. But if you don't try it, you're not going to develop. And I'll come to the reason why a little bit. Then a catalyst is capital controls. They're critical. You cannot allow your country to be washed over with large volumes of capital flows coming in very short term, jacking up your inflation and therefore your bond rates, and then washing out again when there seems to be a little bit of a concern, so that then you have devaluation and maybe some debt that you've incurred in foreign currencies becomes very expensive to service. You need to insulate yourself from that kind of inefficiency, and the Chinese have done that. What you get is debts that are in local currency, so that your central bank is an effective agent in meeting the needs of the financial system's liquidity, and you really can reduce capital flight to harmless levels. You don't reduce it to zero because there's leakage. There are all kinds of over-invoicing, under-invoicing. In Hong Kong is a great leakage tool, but the leakage is very small and manageable compared to what it would be if you opened your capital account and allowed billions of dollars to go with the push of a computer button that would really take away your financial and monetary policy independence. There's a local debt problem because they lent a lot of money, the banks and their development bank, to local platform companies around the country that were responsible for different projects. And these are considered to be quite serious, along with shadow banking, which is some of the ways that other funds have found their way out into the economy that should have gone through the stimulus program. And one of the reasons that these debts from they're local companies set up off budget, which is very important, because on budget you're subject to corruption. Developing countries do not do on budget very well. But one of the Chinese reforms in the 1990s was to establish local infrastructure projects that were separate entities with individual accounting for every small or every bridge, for every road, for every highway, for every center for speaking, and the person in charge of that was personally responsible, and so was the municipality or the county. In interviews with the central bank head, Chen Yuan, he told me his secret. He said, if one project from a municipality is late in servicing its debt, we stop all new projects to that municipality. And you get, therefore, one of the best balance sheets of any bank really in Asia is the Chinese Development Bank. So you also get a result, which a macroeconomist would tell you, and a Keynesian would tell you is perfectly natural, that the stimulus worked. In the 4 years from 2008 to 2012, the economy in nominal terms, which is what's important for debt servicing, grew 65%. And I was at a presentation of the IMF's Article 4 on China at Brookings a couple weeks ago, and they were very concerned that the shadow banking finance in China had grown 60% in the 4 years from 2008 to 2012. And I pointed out, well, but that meant it shrank as a share of GDP. It got smaller because GDP grew at 65%. Fiscal revenues grew almost 100%. That's what fiscal stimulus is supposed to do, but you got to do them. And the Chinese did it with the help of direct management of their financial systems lending, and it has worked very well. There's a new audit coming out that will tell us what's really the status of these local debts. The last local audit showed that it was very manageable. A lot of the debt actually had been incurred before the crisis. A lot of it was longer term. It was for useful projects. And by the way, I don't know, the New York Times carried an excellent article on China's high-speed rail system. In 4 years, it's gone from 0 to 1.8 billion passengers. There have been no deaths since that very first accident. It's increased productivity because instead of taking a day to go from Changsha, the capital, over the mountains from Guangdong to Guangzhou, and taking a whole day, it now takes 2 hours. People are going there for the day and coming back and doing their business. And this network of rail, which was a major part of the stimulus program, is there. All trains are now sold out throughout the network. It's just an excellent example of how a stimulus can not only provide demand but increase productivity. And we have to remember that whoops, what happened there? Did I get that? That most Chinese banks are not banks. They're not banks. They're government-owned deposit-taking institutions. And that therefore they operate for the public will in important ways. I've got to see how optimize this finance. I think, going back. So finally, there are no serious domestic imbalances. And a lot of people think that investment is too high a share of GDP, but a high investment rate is essential for job growth and poverty reduction. If you use it well, that means if you have low inflation, if you can keep consumption growing rapidly, and if you can keep the investment itself fairly efficient, as I think measured most globally by the incremental capital output ratio, the ICOR. And the second myth is that China's consumption share in GDP is declining, and this is a very serious problem. They say, and I would like to, this is consumption growth, and you can see that it has accelerated in the last decade as the investment real growth has also increased. This is an extraordinary rate of real consumption growth nationwide. To have consumption growing this high, at this higher rate, in a sustained way, is a consumption-led growth. China has consumption-led growth, but to grow consumption that quickly, you need rapid growth of investment, and you need a high share of investment in GDP. That's what this last formula here is all about. If you have constant shares of investment, consumption, and net exports, they all grow at the same rate if it's staying constant from year to year. The question is, what is that growth rate? And if it depends to an important degree on the share of investment, then the share of investment, you can choose, you want a high rate of investment or a low rate of investment. If you can implement it well, you obviously want a high rate of investment. And that means that you need to reduce your share of consumption in GDP if you want a high growth rate. It's negatively correlated. But people get that wrong. In fact, there's a mindset that says, oh, no, consumption, and I apologize to IMF people here. This is at their expense. This is a real IMF blooper. I pointed it out to them at this presentation at Brookings. They have a chart that shows the decline in the share of household income, which correlates with the share of household consumption decline, and it's pointed to as a major problem for China. This is orthodoxy in Washington, D.C. Because the consumption share and the income share of household income in China is declining, they are in really serious trouble and have serious imbalances. But look at this slip of the tongue. Per capita household income increased last year after declining for much of the previous decade. It did no such thing. This was published in their Article 4 this summer. It's still on their website as the PDF. And yet you could say it, and they said, oh, that's just a typo. It's not just a typo. This report is vetted, gone through committees, sits down, and it represents a mindset that you find it in the Financial Times, you find it in a lot of commentators on the Chinese economy, that this is unsustainable, that the share of consumption in GDP is going down. Quite the opposite. If you can manage it well, if you want consumption-led growth, you need a high share of investment in GDP and a low share of consumption in GDP. And that's what the Chinese have accomplished. So that keep these myths, in your mind, and the refutation of these myths clear. Back again. So my conclusion that China is a good standard. It's one we should use as the new global context for what development should be like. And the question is, how do you do that somewhere else? China has real world. I don't like to, thanks to Ana Castro's daughter, I don't use the word second best anymore in my writing. I talk about the real world economies. There is an ideal world. A first best doesn't exist anywhere. China is a real world economy solving real world problems. And therefore, this solution is one that will allow China to stay in high single digits at least in the coming years, which is relevant for Brazil's short-term context, if you will. But what China has to offer is a much greater potential for Brazil if it can understand how to manage domestic demand in ways that help it to expand rapidly. And then it will have a chance for success. Otherwise, it's going to stay really a development failure. This is a book that was published by the World Bank, and this is apropos of how can I justify this on first principles, what I'm saying. This Finance for Growth by DiCaprio and Honohan in 2001 or 2002 described finance for growth and how you need to liberalize, open your capital account, have your stock market be more open, and maybe you need to be a little careful with deposit insurance because then that can be misleading. But it also mentions throughout the book that finance is fragile. You need a framework. You need an environment in order for financial institutions to function well. And if you have that environment, then everything's fine. It says absolutely nothing about what to do if you do not have that environment. And if that environment, in fact, is not possible in developing countries. It doesn't say what to do. So this is that point right here. Can emerging markets like Brazil create that environment? China provides the answer. China shows you what to do if you don't have those environment, if you're trying to build finance on something that's a little shaky, a little sandy. So now, my summary of Brazil's prospects. Right now, they're poor. The past and current records are really discouraging. I think the policy tools that Brazil has now are inadequate to really pull itself out of what has been a dismal history of performance. Their external finance is dysfunctional with the wash of capital flows and what it's done to bond deposit rates and to the exchange rate. You're facing social pressures to provide more and more in the way of subsidies that is going to bankrupt your formal on-budget fiscal system, and that needs to be managed. And therefore, you need some major institutional changes. Otherwise, I think the prospects are going to remain poor. Those of you that know the Brazilian history better than I maybe can correct me, but Brazilian's record is discouraging. Since the 1970s, it was discouraging. The huge debt crises and the growth. In recent years, capital inflows. And this year, the second quarter growth was a big improvement. Why? Because agriculture grew rapidly, not manufacturing. That is not a formula for economic development success. You need to move the productivity off the farm and put it into manufacturing and the service sector. And this is sort of an historical comparison. This is based on per capita GDP at constant 2005 prices. This is where Brazil was in the 1970s. This is where South Korea was. This is where China is now. So China's, about maybe 40 years behind. And what happened? Because South Korea is an Asian economy that followed pretty much the policies I've described in terms of targeted lending and other policies until they unwisely opened their capital account and then ran into the Asian financial crisis, which slowed their growth dramatically.